50 years ago, older Americans had no smartphones, no Facebook, no video calls, and yet they rarely described themselves as lonely. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the share of older adults reporting severe loneliness has nearly doubled over the past 30 years, even as communication technology expanded in ways no previous generation could have imagined. More than 17 million Americans over 65 are living in severe social isolation right now, more than the combined population of the New York metro area. The United States Surgeon General has officially declared loneliness among older adults a public health crisis. Not an emotional inconvenience, but a medical condition with a measurable mortality rate. The real puzzle is not why so many older Americans are lonely today, but why the generation before them, living with far fewer material comforts, managed to stay deeply connected without any of the tools we now take for granted. The answer lives in how we design our lives, our spaces, and the very meaning of growing old. And science has started to decode exactly what changed. The human brain is wired for social connection in much the same way it is wired to breathe, not as a bonus feature, but as a fundamental biological need. When we interact with others in person, the brain releases oxytocin, a hormone that lowers cortisol, stabilizes blood pressure, and activates immune responses in ways no application can replicate. This is not something science just discovered. It is something the human body has known for millions of years, but something that modern social architecture is quietly dismantling. Before the 1980s, most older Americans lived in communities with naturally high social density. Not because they deliberately tried to connect, but because the structure of daily life made encounter unavoidable. Churches, corner grocery stores, local diners, civic clubs, the small post office at the center of town. None of these spaces were designed for entertainment, but all of them functioned as mandatory convergence points for daily life. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg called these spaces the third place, not home, not work, but the third location where community is actually maintained. According to a University of Michigan study published in 2019, older adults with at least 3 regularly visited third places had a 43% lower rate of depression than those without any. What mattered was not the quality of any individual conversation in those spaces, but their predictable repetition, the ability to encounter the same person at the same time each week. Social psychologist Julianne Holt-Lunstad at Brigham Young University analyzed over 300 studies and concluded that social isolation increases the risk of early death at a level equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes per riotous day. This is not a metaphor. Chronic loneliness activates systemic inflammatory responses, elevates C-reactive protein levels in the blood, and weakens immune function through mechanisms identical to chronic stress. But to understand why the previous generation of older Americans was less vulnerable, we need to look at what actually changed. Not the people themselves, but the environment surrounding them. The dividing line between normal aging and dangerous isolation does not lie in feelings of sadness, but in one specific measure: meaningful in-person contact falling below 3 times per week. And this is the point where everything shifts. When we understand that physical space, urban policy, and transportation systems inadvertently became mass production machines for loneliness. What killed the social connection of older Americans was not age itself, but urban architecture. Let us begin in the 1950s and 60s, the period researchers call the golden era of American social capital. Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam documented that during that era, Americans participated in an average of 17 civic and social organizations over their lifetime, from bowling leagues to parent-teacher associations. Picture this. The number of civic organizations an average American participates in over a lifetime dropped from 17 to fewer than 3 in 40 years, a loss of more than 80% of the structural foundation for social connection. What changed was not the character of Americans, but the physical environment that either permitted or prevented natural encounter from occurring. After World War II, the federal government invested more than $100 billion in the interstate highway system, a commitment that permanently restructured how Americans physically lived alongside one another. These roads made the automobile a prerequisite for participation in social life. And when you can no longer drive, when vision dims or reflexes slow after 70, you are cut off from nearly everything. According to the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety, approximately 15% of Americans over 75 no longer drive. And among those, nearly 60% report leaving home fewer than once per week. Think about this from a neurological perspective. The aging brain is not programmed to tolerate isolation. It is programmed to detect isolation as a survival threat and activate chronic stress responses. The amygdala, the brain region controlling fear responses, operates at persistently elevated levels in chronically lonely older adults, driving higher cortisol at night and cyclically disrupted sleep architecture. This spiral is self-reinforcing. Poor sleep amplifies anxiety. Anxiety reduces motivation for social engagement. Reduced engagement deepens loneliness, and the brain grows progressively more sensitive to signals of rejection. But in the previous generation, social structure broke this spiral before it could begin, because connection was not a voluntary choice but something nearly impossible to avoid. Berkeley sociologist Claude Fisher noted that before the 1980s, the average American could name at least 6 neighbors they knew well, a number that has since dropped to fewer than 2. Let that number sink in. From 6 neighbors to fewer than 2. That is not a small decline. That is the collapse of an informal social support system that had functioned for centuries. Interestingly, the data shows that loneliness in older adults does not primarily come from loss of loved ones, but from loss of small, incidental, unplanned contact with familiar strangers. Psychologist Gillian Sandstrom at the University of Sussex calls these people weak tie acquaintances, the grocery cashier, the postal clerk, the familiar barber, and science confirms these weak ties exert a powerful influence on mental health. These incidental encounters activate a different part of the brain's reward system than deep relationships do, generating a sense of belonging to a broader community without requiring emotional investment. But American urban design, after 1970, systematically eliminated most opportunities for these encounters by replacing walkable spaces with drivable ones. According to WalkScore, which measures the walkability of American communities, only 25% of Americans live in areas where they can reach basic daily needs on foot without a car. For older adults who no longer drive, that number means they cannot independently reach a grocery store, a church, a pharmacy, all the places their parents once walked to in 30 minutes. But there is a second factor that receives far less attention, and it concerns how the American economy restructured the very meaning of old age. In pre-industrial communities, and even through the early decades of the 20th century, older Americans held clear social roles: keeper of history, transmitter of skills, caregiver of grandchildren, coordinator of community. The prevalence of the multi-generational household, where 3 or 4 generations lived in the same home or the same block, created specific and irreplaceable daily roles for older adults. According to Pew Research Center data, the share of older Americans living in multi-generational households dropped from over 70% in 1940 to below 20% by 2020. For millions of older Americans reviewing medical results alone in a clinic waiting room, that is not just data on paper. It is a question about who will be there when they need someone. A third physiological mechanism, less often discussed, was described by Mayo Clinic researchers in 2021. Chronic loneliness alters how the brain processes social information in increasingly negative directions. Older adults living in prolonged isolation begin interpreting neutral social signals as hostile, begin withdrawing before rejection can occur, and ultimately become more sensitive to negative experiences than to positive ones. This is not a personality change, but a measurable neurological shift, the brain learning to protect the body from social pain by avoiding all contact, including healthy contact. In the previous generation, this protective mechanism was rarely triggered because social interactions were frequent and familiar enough that the brain never entered alert mode. There is a fourth factor that almost no one discusses, and it concerns the role of life purpose in maintaining neurological health in older adults. The Rush Memory and Aging Project, a longitudinal study tracking over 1,000 older adults in Chicago for more than 20 years, found that those with a high sense of life purpose had a risk of developing Alzheimer's disease that was 2/3 lower. Life purpose is not an abstraction, but something generated through specific roles in community, created when someone needs you in a specific place at a specific time. Older Americans of the previous generation were regularly entrusted with grandchild care, local club leadership, and civic organization roles, all of which created structured schedules and daily reasons to leave home. Today, those roles have been professionalized or automated. Children are in structured care from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Civic clubs have dissolved, and older adults are more often positioned as recipients of services rather than providers of them. This means that for many older Americans today, each morning begins without rigid structure, without anyone waiting for them, without a role that must be fulfilled. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University emphasizes that the brain needs prediction, needs to know what tomorrow holds in order to maintain emotional equilibrium, and when that predictability disappears, background anxiety becomes the default state. The previous generation of older adults did not experience this, not because they were psychologically stronger, but because their lives were designed so that each day had a community-imposed structure. And when all these protective mechanisms disappear simultaneously, space becomes isolating, roles dissolve, daily structure collapses. The impact on physical health is not just sadness, but measurable biological damage. Research from the University of California, San Francisco, published in 2012, found that lonely older adults experienced cognitive decline 20% faster each year than those who were not lonely. There is a fifth factor that no one expected, and it concerns the role of technology, not as a savior, but as something that complicates the picture in surprising ways. A University of Michigan study from 2017 found that older adults using social media more than 3 hours per day reported higher rates of loneliness, not lower, compared to those who did not use it. The reason is not that technology is harmful, but that digital interaction does not activate the same array of physiological receptors as physical contact, does not produce oxytocin at equivalent levels, and does not carry the same cortisol-regulating effect. This is the crucial point the previous generation never had to worry about. All of their connections were physical, all were in person, all fully activated the physiological systems designed to maintain health. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, which tracked over 700 men and their families across 8 decades, concluded definitively that the quality of relationships is the single best predictor of health and well-being in old age. Not cholesterol, not body mass index, not genetics, but the degree of genuine social connection a person maintains across decades. And what is truly remarkable is that the people in that study with the richest social lives were not necessarily the wealthiest, but those who lived in communities with the richest social infrastructure. Older Americans of earlier generations were less lonely, not because they tried harder, but because they lived inside a system that inadvertently ensured they were never alone for too long. That system was imperfect. It discriminated and excluded many groups. But for those included in it, it provided a biological safety net we are only now beginning to learn how to deliberately recreate. This is the moment when everything we have explored converges into a clearer picture. And the question shifts from why to what can actually be done with this knowledge. The consequences of America's senior loneliness crisis are not measured only in emotional suffering, but in specific clinical outcomes and quantifiable financial costs. Chronic loneliness increases the risk of cardiovascular disease by 29%, stroke by 32%, and dementia by 50%, according to a meta-analysis published in the journal Heart in 2016. The immune systems of lonely older adults respond less effectively to flu vaccines, according to Carnegie Mellon research, meaning the most isolated people are also the least protected against the most preventable illnesses. From a financial perspective, Medicare spends approximately $6 billion per year on costs directly linked to loneliness and social isolation in older adults, according to AARP Foundation estimates, more than the total annual health budget of several smaller states. Lonely older adults visit emergency rooms more often, experience longer hospital stays, and recover more slowly, not because their conditions are clinically more severe, but because the brain and body have been deprived of the social signals needed for healing. The impact on daily quality of life for lonely older adults is more troubling than the statistics suggest. They lose independent living capacity an average of 3 to 4 years earlier than those with strong social connection. Losing independence is not only losing the ability to care for oneself, it is losing identity, losing the sense that one is still the subject of one's own life. More than 70% of older Americans live in low walkability suburban communities, according to the AARP Public Policy Institute's 2022 report, not an abstract statistic, but the geographic reality of the crisis. Yet even within that picture, there are notable exceptions, and science is beginning to decode why some communities protect their older residents far better than others. The answer lies not in returning to the past, but in deliberately redesigning the protective elements the past provided naturally. And that is exactly where research and public policy are beginning to converge. And that brings us to the most important part of this story. What science and lived experience are pointing to about what can actually be done. Public health researchers at Johns Hopkins University tracked communities that implemented proactive policies to rebuild social infrastructure for older adults and found results worth examining closely. Those communities become the bridge to the final part of this story, not as perfect examples, but as evidence that what was lost can be rebuilt, even if in a different form. There is no single solution, but there is increasingly strong evidence that 3 categories of change can produce measurable differences in less time than most people assume. And what is most striking is that those changes do not require older adults to try harder at connecting. They require redesigning the environment so that connection happens naturally. This is the core of the entire story. The previous generation was less lonely not because individuals did better, but because systems worked on their behalf. And the question for this generation is whether we can rebuild those systems, because no one should have to try hard not to be lonely, especially when the scientific evidence shows that social connection is something the body needs the way it needs water and air. So what is science actually pointing toward? The evidence-backed things that older Americans and those who care about them can begin asking about right now. Research from UCLA on time bank programs found that older adults participating in skill exchange systems with younger people showed significantly lower loneliness scores after just 6 months. The most important conversation an older American can have with a physician is not about new medication, but about whether that physician screens for loneliness as a vital sign, the way blood pressure and heart rate are measured. The most significant medical advance in this field is not a new drug, but the American health system's growing recognition of social prescribing as a formal medical intervention. Kaiser Permanente's social prescribing pilot program in California connects older adults with community activities matched to their interests and mobility level, and early results show a 21% reduction in emergency department visits. In urban design, Portland, Oregon, and Minneapolis, Minnesota are pioneering integration of the World Health Organization's age-friendly cities standards into new development codes, with notable population health outcomes beginning to emerge. Even at the individual level, Stanford research shows that just 2 to 3 meaningful in-person contacts per week with people outside the household is sufficient to produce measurable changes in inflammatory biomarkers. Not dozens of friends, not a packed calendar, just 2 to 3 times per week, consistently enough, and in person. What communities can ask about right now includes high school peer connection programs, linking students with local older adults, co-housing projects with shared garden spaces, and transit policies, prioritizing mobility for older adults who no longer drive. And this is the science that the next generation of older Americans can use to ask better questions of their physicians, legislators, and city planners. Not to demand, but to open conversations that have not yet begun. Older Americans of earlier generations were not a uniquely heroic or exceptional generation. They simply lived inside a system inadvertently designed to protect the very thing their bodies needed most. That can be rebuilt, imperfectly, incompletely, not in the same form, but the biological principles underlying it, the need for regular in-person contact, meaningful roles, daily structure, walkable community, those do not change. Because, as Robert Waldinger, director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, has noted, it is not wealth, not fame, not hard work, but good relationships that keep us healthy and happy. The next great medical advance may not come from a laboratory, but from votes on urban planning, public transit policy, and housing design. And at the individual level, the simplest thing anyone can do today is name 3 places outside the home they visit at least once per week, consistently enough for the people there to begin recognizing them. Not to be bolder, not to talk more, just to be present often enough that the brain begins classifying that environment as safe, because that is how the previous generation did it. Not with extra effort, but with the consistency that made their environment feel like it belonged to them. 17 million Americans over 65 are living in severe social isolation today, more than the combined population of the entire New York and Los Angeles metro areas. That number does not change just because you have finished watching this. But what can change is the question you ask your physician, your city council, your children, the next time you have the opportunity. Because loneliness is not an inevitable fate of old age. It is the consequence of bad design. And bad design can be fixed. The science has the answer. And that answer does not require miracles. It requires political will, better urban design, and the recognition that community health begins with whether older adults can walk to where they need to go. Older Americans of earlier generations did not need to be taught how not to be lonely because their lives were designed to prevent it from the outside, not the inside. And finally, the most important question anyone with an older loved one can ask themselves is not, are they feeling okay, but is their life designed so that they naturally encounter other people? 50 years ago, the answer to that question was usually yes, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the world around them did it for them. Today, the answer is more often no. And that is not the fault of older people, but of design decisions made decades ago, whose consequences are still being felt deeply today. But those consequences are not permanent, because across America, communities choosing to redesign their spaces so older adults can live in connection are beginning to measure the change in their population health data. And perhaps that is the most hopeful thing in all of what science is telling us. Design can be changed. And when design changes, lives change with it. 17 million Americans are severely lonely right now. And after this screen goes dark, each of us can ask ourselves, what can I do to change the design of the life around me? Not for myself, but for the older adult living alongside me? Older Americans of earlier generations were not lonely. Not because they did anything special, but because they lived in a world designed to bring people together without anyone needing to ask permission or make a plan.